And Chair Tatayan, the floor is yours.
Great. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Happy Earth Day. Welcome to the April 22, 2021 Delta Stewardship Council meeting. I'm Susan Tatayan, Chair of the Council. Glad to be with you today. Let's start with a roll call, starting with Judge Damrell.
Damrell here.
And our new council member, Virginia Madueño.
Present.
Maria Maranian.
Here.
Christy Smith.
Here.
And I am here. And has Daniel joined us yet?
I don't see him on the line yet.
Okay. Well, we have a quorum. We can proceed. Quickly to let folks know, we have we'll be having a general comment opportunity during the chair's report. So we're trying something a little different. We're offering the opportunity to comment on items not on the agenda earlier in the meeting proceeding. So on to agenda item 3, the consent calendar. Council members, this is an action item. And let me check first, is there any public comment on the consent calendar?
No public comment.
Okay, thank you, Beck. We will then, members, is there any need for discussion on any of the items on the consent calendar? Okay, hearing none, do I hear a motion to accept
the adoption of the consent calendar?
Moved
Second.
by Judge Damrell and second by Councilmember Smith. And if there are no objections to adopting the consent calendar, we can consider it adopted, a unanimous adoption.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Susan, this is Daniel. I apologize. I was a little late getting on, but I want to be part of that consent. Thank you.
Certainly. Good morning, Daniel. Happy Earth Day.
Thank you. Good morning.
Well, then the consent calendar is adopted by unanimous consent. Let's move on to agenda item 4, the chair's report. For the chair's report, I want to share that I attended the 11th Biennial Bay Delta's Science Conference, and it was absolutely fabulous. The planning team and the moderators, the coordinators, it was a fantastic conference, and you'll be hearing more about it from our lead scientist, Dr. Laura Larson. And I also am very happy to welcome aboard our new council member, Virginia Madueño. We're so happy that you're joining us.
Thank
Virginia,
you so
do you
much.
want to share a few comments with us?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you to you, Susan, for taking the time to speak with me and to give me and administer the official oath of office. I have read and researched and have gone through the website and actually have listened in on a few of the older meetings and recognize that this is truly a wonderful opportunity. I'm looking forward to learning from all of you. I'm hoping to insert myself in some of these discussions and hopefully bring something to the table. I think the work that you are all doing is commendable, important and critical given where we are right now in our time. So what an appropriate day for me to join you on Earth Day. So thank you so very much. I look forward to working with each and every one of you.
Thank you, Virginia. We can now move on to agenda item 5, the general public comment. Any public comment on any topic not on the agenda?
No comments.
Okay. Well, then I will quickly do some housekeeping for the remainder of the meeting. If any member of the public is interested in providing public comment, please send an email blue card to the clerk at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov as seen on the screen. And be sure to note your name and the agenda item that you wish to comment on. Also, please note if you wish to speak or would like the clerk to read your comment for you. And when your name is called, the clerk will unmute you or read your comment if requested.
Madam Chair, I'm here now.
Oh, good morning, Don. Happy
morning.
Earth Day.
Same to you. Apologies for being a few minutes late. So
Quite all right. We can now move on to agenda item 6, the executive officer's report with Jessica Pearson.
Good morning. I'd also like to extend my welcome to Councilmember Madueño. I look forward to working with you and introducing you to all of the exciting things that we've got going on here at the council. And just a historic note, this is the first time in the history of the council that we've had a majority of women members. Yay. So I'd like to start my report with our regular announcement regarding remote operations during the pandemic. Staff continue to work remotely and are available to assist the public. Our public meeting formats are fully remote per state guidance. If anyone needs to contact staff at the council, you're encouraged to email hello@deltacouncil.ca.gov to be directed to the appropriate staff person. Anyone interested in our public meetings should sign up for our email listserv or check our website where information and updates for the council's public meetings are posted, including participation information. As a reminder, the Department of Water Resources submitted a certification of consistency for the Lookout Slough Tidal Habitat Restoration and Flood Improvement Project. 4 parties appealed the certification. As noticed earlier this month, the date for the public hearing regarding the certification's appeals has been set for May 20th and May 21st, starting at 9 a.m. each day and held virtually on both days. The first day will be reserved for the Delta Protection Commission, appellants, and DWR to make oral presentations. And the second day will be dedicated to public comment. The council will make findings either denying the appeals or remanding the matter to the department no later than 60 days following the hearing. Please continue to adhere to the council's ex parte restrictions as the certification undergoes the appeals process. And if you have any questions, please let me know or our attorney, Vera Bezticek. Information regarding the appeals and the certification is available on our website under Delta Plan, then select Covered Actions on the drop-down menu and scroll down to find Lookout Slough. Details for the hearing will also be posted to our website. I have a couple of personnel announcements to share. First, I'm excited to announce that Ryan Stambra has been appointed as the council's new Chief Deputy Executive Officer. Since January, Ryan has served in the acting Chief Deputy role and has been the council's legislative and policy advisor for the previous 6 years. Ryan has played a pivotal role in advising on key council initiatives, including the implementation of the reduced reliance on the Delta policy. He's also supported interagency coordination and outreach for our ongoing Delta Levies investment strategy work. And he has also helped me to work to increase funding for critical science investments and more. So I'm excited to work with Ryan in this new leadership role, and please join me in congratulating him. In addition, Beck Barger joins the Office of Public Participation as our new council clerk. She's here with us today, and she will also be supporting our public participation efforts. Beck comes to the council with a background in sustainable fisheries and logistics management. She was running her own sustainable seafood business, working with small-scale sustainable fishers to connect them to local retailers. She's also worked as field staff for EcoTrust, where she worked to foster relationships with the fishing community to resolve issues around changing regulations and economic uncertainty. So please join me in welcoming Beck.
Hello.
The outreach highlights report Our active projects list and our quarterly contract update are available in your board packets. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Today, we do not have a legal update and there is no oral legislative update, although the legislative report is available in your packets for review. And just quickly to preview the agenda ahead, we have our Delta Adapts Adaptation Strategy Kickoff discussion, where council staff will provide an update on the Delta Adapts Climate Initiative, including the preliminary process to develop the adaptation strategy. We'll present that for discussion and your input. We'll also have staff from the Department of Water Resources and the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority, who will provide the council with a regular update on the Delta Conveyance project's ongoing progress. And with that, unless there are any questions, I conclude my executive officer's report.
Any questions for Jessica? Great, thank you, Jessica. I understand that there are a couple of public comments, and I'm guessing they were intended for agenda item 5, the general public comment. Is that the case, Brandon or Beck?
Yes, it is. Sorry, those came in just a little bit late. So let me go ahead and unmute them.
And the first commenter, if you could state your name and affiliation for us, please.
This is Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I've sent some correspondence to the council members about the Delta Independent Science Board. But I just pleading for the council to find a way to restore funding for the Delta Independent Science Board. They had contracts for up to $680,000 worth of work a year, and the new per diem structure, it's $100 per day. And at the last meeting, one of the members said that with that compensation structure, they can only do about 1 review a year. And it's just not enough to carry out their statutory duties, which are just critically important in this time of climate change. And particularly the monitoring enterprise review, which is enormous, is happening right now. And it's really being affected. But monitoring is incredibly important, and having these preeminent scientists with all of us incredible experience in estuary management, it's really necessary to have them look at it and give you their insights. So I know that the chair and the executive director have been working on this, but $100 per diem is just not enough to fund peer review by senior scientists. And they have been doing a few hours a month, but particularly the new scientists early on expressed that they weren't going to invest a lot of time in learning about our region. We have a lot of new scientists from out of state, unless they were given the pay that they were promised a part-time salary when they were recruited. So I hope that you can find a way to keep that promise and retain these eminent scientists. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for taking the time to comment, Deirdre. And the next commenter, Beck, is?
Anna Swenson is next, and I'll go ahead and unmute her now.
Hello, my name is Anna Swenson, and I live here in Clarksburg. And I'm going to dovetail off of what Deirdre said. The Delta Independent Science Board has always been a beacon of light for the people in the Delta because we are such a unique environment, and this estuary is very important to us. And we really take pride in the Independent Science Board because we feel that they are a neutral party that can provide us with data and scientific information that will be useful for not just the Delta Stewardship Council, but all facets of the management of the estuary. And it's a little disheartening to someone like me who's a resident here to hear that that process is being underfunded. And so I really would like to encourage you to please relook into that process and see if there is something that can be done. It's vitally important to create and to distribute independent information that is fair and transparent and based upon scientific data. And there's not enough information about the Delta to make the vital decisions that we're going to have to make now and into the future. And as we're rolling into a year where a lot of the engineers are saying it's going to be comparable to 1977 drought, we really need as much smart minds focused on the issues that we have at hand and to be able to provide us with, good data that we can rely on and make good decisions into the future. So thank you, Deirdre. And I'm just going to say I agree with what she said and to please consider it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to comment and be with us today. Well, if there are no other public comments, we can move on to agenda item 7, the lead scientist report with Dr. Laurel Larson.
Madam Chair, this is Daniel Zingoli. I just wanted to jump in real quickly just to thank Deirdre and Anna for participating. I know I'm not alone here in just looking forward to the public comments, and yours certainly resonate. The ideas you expressed had been shared with us by our chair and executive director, but it's really great to hear them directly from members of the public too. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. So now on to the lead scientist report. Dr. Laurel Larson, is Laurel with us now? There she is.
Just switching over from CDFW Prop 1 funding meeting. So thank you all for the time today and your understanding, and happy Earth Day and greetings to Councilmember Madueno.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with an article spotlight, and this article is written by Annika Keeley, who's one of the staff members of the Delta Science program. And I would just like to send a kudos to everyone who works in the Delta Science program, because not only do they shepherd through processes like the Science Action Agenda and reviews, but many of them are also involved in individual research. And this is one great example of that. So just to back up a little bit, some of the biggest conservation challenges that we face in the Delta require a landscape scale approach to planning. For example, as temperatures warm and sea level rises, species are likely to shift their ranges, seeking cooler temperatures. A major conservation challenge is that of ensuring that those species will be able to access favorable habitat under both current and future conditions. If you're a bird, you might be able to fly from an unfavorable patch on the landscape to a favorable patch. But if you're an amphibian, rising sea levels, for example, might trap you on an island of higher ground, leaving you without pathways to access food or mates. Alternatively, rising sea levels may leave you with a narrow corridor that you could traverse to access a much larger patch of favorable habitat upslope. So distinguishing between these outcomes and comparing between different scenarios faced by different species requires a way to effectively quantify the spatial configuration of the landscape with respect to those movement and dispersal characteristics of the species of interest. Landscape ecologists have developed many types of connectivity metrics that accomplish this objective. Some connectivity metrics, which are known as structural metrics, are based on the configuration of binary habitat and non-habitat patches within the landscape. Other connectivity metrics, which are known as functional connectivity metrics, are based on actual observations of how organisms and genes move through landscapes. Between structural and connectivity and functional connectivity metrics are a range of other ways to quantify connectivity that might account for the ease with which different species can move through different types of non-habitat, or simply how far each species is dispersed before it needs to encounter another habitat patch in order to survive. So as you're beginning to get a sense for, there are many ways to quantify a complex spatial phenomenon and how it might impact different species with different characteristics. While this diversity of tools is generally a good thing, it's probable that there's a tool that addresses the specific research or conservation question of interest. It can also be problematic because there's no one metric that fits all applications, which creates challenges for applicability to environmental management. In addition, adoption of a landscape scale approach to conservation challenges is really in its infancy. So this is a hot area of research interest that there's been abundant progress on in recent years. So recognizing this, the Delta Science Program convened a symposium on connectivity in 2020. You might remember a lead scientist report or a summary that John Calloway gave in his lead scientist report back then. So the Delta Science Program's Annika Keeley was one of the conveners of that symposium, and she just came out with this paper in Biological Conservation that synthesizes this body of work and directly applies it to conservation challenges. Brandon, were you able to get the slide for this? If not, don't worry about it. She also presented an excellent overview of connectivity in her talk at the Bay Delta Science Conference just a week ago. So namely, in her paper, Dr. Keeley reviews 35 different connectivity metrics, and she develops a decision tree for conservation managers in order to help them determine the most appropriate connectivity metric for their conservation objective, given the landscape context and, if applicable, the species of interest. One of the things I really like about this paper is the general discussion that it engages in with respect to biological conservation in general. The discussion reinforces the argument that connectivity of a landscape may be quite different for birds versus fish, or even males versus females of the same species. Moreover, future connectivity for specific species might be very difficult to predict if the fundamental nature of the habitat is changing as a result of climate change and sea level rise. With this in mind, it suggests that perhaps the most useful way to quantify the connectivity of a landscape for conservation purposes and long-term resiliency is to evaluate simple structural connectivity based on natural versus heavily modified areas and prioritize particular areas for conservation on the basis of maximizing that physical connectivity. And give me just a moment with the slide coming up. My Zoom window took over my whole screen. Hold on. Okay. As agencies begin to implement the 30 by 30 goal and also to think strategically about conservation, this article serves as an important reminder to do so in a landscape context. And it provides useful tools that can be employed to compare different alternatives. Now, these types of tools might also be beneficial in the context of Delta Adapts and thinking about the sort of Delta landscapes that will promote the greatest ecological resiliency in the face of climate change. They're the sorts of tools that could be readily incorporated into scenario development or modeling platforms such as the Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool, a tool developed by our partners at San Francisco Estuary Institute through funding from the Delta Stewardship Council that's been generating a lot of excitement within DPIC member agencies. So the takeaway that I want to leave you with today about this article is that planning at the landscape scale is absolutely essential in ensuring the resiliency of the Delta in the face of climate change, and that there are a number of tools for comparing alternative management strategies that are available. But we really do need to invest in that forward-looking science and collaborative scenario planning to get there. So are there any questions about this article spotlight? Thanks, Brendan, for bringing up the slide. One of the things that you'll see on this slide is this is actually a figure that comes from the paper that illustrates the spectrum of different ways to think about the connectivity of a landscape, where on the left, you have structural connectivity in which you classify the landscape based on habitat or non-habitat, and certain species might be able to traverse large patches of non-habitat, whereas other species aren't. So that's really the second figure over there. Sorry, my screen was jumping around again. And then on the right-hand side, you have ways to think about landscape connectivity that are specific to certain species and are based on how each individual species is able to move through patches of non-habitat. And on the far right, you have functional connectivity that's really just quantified by observations of species movement through the landscape, or observations of how genes move through the landscape. So I'll end that article spotlight and open the floor for questions before I go on to report on Delta Science Program activities.
Madam Chair, this is Member Natoli. I just wanted to ask Laurel, Dr. Larson. So those on the right-hand side, the one is fairly graphic in its color and so forth. Could you just take I can't see the legend there. So here it goes for the color spectrum there. So could you just explain? Yeah. I get the concept that you're pointing out here, but if you could just.
Yeah. So we're talking about the one that's second from the right-hand side.
Yes.
This way of viewing landscapes doesn't view those landscapes as binaries, as simply habitat or non-habitat. It does classify the habitat for species, but the intervening areas are quantified, or they're ranked based on how easily that particular species moves through that type of landscape. And so the colors here, the colors in this particular diagram represent the resistance of those non-habitat patches. So the blue is low resistance species that can easily move through that portion of the landscape, whereas yellow and the warmer colors are high resistance. And the legend actually says circuitscape current, and that's because some of these connectivity metrics represent or do this quantification kind of on the basis of how currents through electrical circuits are quantified.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, so you see that something like that could be really complex and probably not suitable for a lot of management. It would differ for every species. If you're very interested in a particular species, this could be a useful representation of the landscape. But one of the arguments of this article is that, we could really get a long way to anticipating how resilient a landscape is likely to be for a variety of species just by looking at the delineation of natural versus human-dominated patches of the landscape, and ensuring that there are these natural landscape corridors that a large number of species could potentially access. Thank you for that question. Any other?
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to go on to, I'm going to next move on to some introductions before I report on Delta Science Program activities. And I hope everyone who I'm going to introduce is here. I know that some of us are going between the CDFW Prop 1 Delta Subcommittee and this meeting this morning. So not everyone may be here, but I would like to introduce the 2021 class of California Sea Grant State Fellows. So the State Policy Fellows program, which is administered through California Sea Grant, situates some of the top people in master's and PhD programs in the area with local agencies to help translate science into policy. And we have 4 that are situated within the Delta Stewardship Council that we're very happy to welcome. The first is Emily Reisner, who is situated within the Delta Science Program Collaborative Science and Peer Review Unit. Emily, are you here right now? I know she is also attending the other meeting this morning. Okay, maybe she wasn't able to come over. The second person I'd like to introduce is Jenica Moffett, who is based within the Science-Based Adaptive Management Unit within the Delta Science Program. And Jenica, are you here?
Yes.
Great.
Hi, I'm Jenica Moffett, and I'm very excited to be joining the Science-Based Adaptive Management Unit with the Delta Science Program. A little bit about my background. My experience in research actually began in the Delta when I worked as an undergrad with Dr. Peter Moyle and Dr. John Durand at the Center for Watershed Sciences at UC Davis, where I started off analyzing zooplankton samples and getting some field experience. And I loved it so much that after graduating, I stuck around for a couple years as a junior specialist, and I helped support and lead some of their monitoring programs in the Delta and Sassoon, including the Arc of Native Fishes Project, the Sassoon Marsh Fish Study, and the Complete Marsh Project. And then I left to get my master's degree at California State University Northridge with Dr. Casey Churhorst, where my research focus kind of shifted a little to more eco-evolutionary questions. And I used a model Nigerian microalgal mutualism to look at how temperature affects this type of relationship. But I'm very excited to kind of be returning back to the Delta where my roots are in kind of this new role. And I'll be helping both the Adaptive Management Unit as well as the Independent Science Board, working on, for example, helping to finish up the monitoring enterprise review. And I'm very excited for all this work.
Thank you so much, Jenica. We're really excited to have you on board. Next,
Dr. Larson, sorry to interrupt. Emily, it was a little delayed in getting everyone over. Emily is over here now.
Great. So again, Emily Reisner is situated within the Collaborative Science and Peer Review Unit. And here's Emily.
Hello, I'm Emily. As Laurel said, I have been placed within the Collaborative Science and Peer Review Unit. And a little bit about my background. I am a native Michigander, but I came over to California to pursue an undergrad degree in marine biology at UC Santa Cruz. And so during my time there, I became heavily involved with work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, specifically with abalone restoration. And then following graduating, I helped a little more with that, but then also became a scientific aid with the Groundfish Ecosystem Management Project. So kind of worked with that for a year, and then I decided to continue my education and pursued a PhD at UCLA, and just finished a couple of weeks ago. So my dissertation was mainly focused on assessing community vulnerability and resistance to species invasions, specifically a pervasive marine alga in Southern California, and how that was impacting important native species such as giant kelp. So primarily focused in the marine realm, but in my free time, I was volunteering with a national nonprofit as a technical assistant, interpreting policy documents related to SGMA, as well as helping disadvantaged communities in Solano County and helping them become involved with SGMA and the sustainability plan. So that kind of shifted my focus and interests into kind of more freshwater or estuarine realm. And that kind of motivated me to pursue this position within the Collaborative Science and Peer Review Unit. And I'm really excited. I've been learning a lot, and thank you for welcoming me.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you for the introduction. That's certainly a lot of really relevant expertise to the type of questions that we work on in the Delta. Next, I would like to introduce Karen Gutierrez, who is situated within the Science Communication Synthesis and Decision Support Unit within the Delta Science Program. And she will be helping me prepare future lead scientist reports. So Karen, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here, sorry. getting situated. Hi, good morning, everyone. Nice to meet everybody. So as Dr. Larson mentioned, I'm going to be helping with things like the lead scientist report as the fellow in science communication synthesis and decision support unit. So I'm really excited for that. And just a little bit about me is that I'm originally from Mexico, so I was raised there for the first 8 years of my life. Then I moved to LA where I grew up, and I felt very much removed from nature growing up in LA. So in college, I decided to pursue a geology degree, which is how I ended up at UC San Diego for my undergrad, where I graduated with an earth sciences degree. I stayed here for a 1-year master's program, which I also just finished a couple weeks ago. It feels like months at this point. And so yeah, I'm still in San Diego. I really like it here. It's becoming very much my home now. And I'm looking forward to working, as I mentioned, in science communication, just because as a first-gen college student, communicating a lot of what I was working on as a undergrad and graduate student to my family or even just friends who are in non-STEM fields. It was always kind of a struggle, and I was like, this is something that's almost as important, if not more, than the actual science itself. So something that I'm really interested in getting into.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks for that background. I agree with that last point that you made. And then the fourth fellow that I'll be introducing is Sarah Farnsworth, who is situated in the Planning and Performance Division of the Delta Stewardship Council. Sarah.
All right. Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm actually hitting my 3-month point in the planning division, so I feel pretty comfortable and nested in now. Mostly I've been working on Delta Adapts and environmental justice efforts, as well as some other tasks. But a little bit about me, I earned my bachelor's in marine science from CSU Monterey Bay. While there, I started doing some research on marine reserves and protected areas and spending time at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, volunteering. I just got really interested in the policy and outreach and that whole side of marine science. So I decided to earn my master's in environmental policy and management from UC Davis. Graduated this last year, right when the pandemic hit. But while I was there, I did a whole bunch of positions working at SACOG and transportation planning, with Nature Conservancy, with CDFW, whole bunch of things. And I realized there's just so many fields to get involved in, and I'm really interested in a lot of them. So that led me to this position in the planning division. Even though my background is pretty marine focused, I'm really excited, to kind of dig into such complex and important work in this area of California. And I didn't mention, but I grew up in Sacramento, so I've been really familiar with the Delta. So it's kind of cool to, actually do some work in it at this point. So with that, thank you for welcoming all of us. It's pretty exciting to be here.
It's definitely exciting to have a new cohort of fellows come on board, and thank you all for being here today and for the introductions. And again, we're very much looking forward to working with you over the next year. So I'm going to pivot to a discussion of some recent activities. And as you know, the Bay Delta Science Conference took place 2 weeks ago. Thanks to all of you who attended. It was great to see several of you there. And I'm really happy to report that despite of, or perhaps because of, the virtual format of the meeting, we had more attendees than ever before. Maggie Chrisman reports that we had 1,697 unique logins compared to a previous high of 1,300 in 2014 and an average of 1,000 to 1,200 total registrations in past conferences. So I think we owe Maggie Chrisman and Lynn Takata, as well as Zinger Productions, the company that they worked with, a huge kudos for pulling off a successful virtual conference and really entering unprecedented territory with the format of this meeting. I do think it was a huge success. Also, a shout out to Steve Culberson. As you know, the Bay Delta Science Conference was held in concurrence with the Interagency Ecological Program workshop, and both sessions went very well. One important thing to note is that you could still access talks either in the live sessions or in the pre-recorded sessions online. But that is going away as of tomorrow. So if there are talks that you really wanted to hear but haven't had a chance to tune into yet, please try to make it a priority to do so before the end of the day tomorrow. The word I hear is that Zinger Productions and Maggie's team is in the process of moving all of the content over to Vimeo so that all of the recordings will be available for people until the fall, but it's not quite ready to launch yet. So in the near term, do try to watch those talks that you weren't able to make it to. I also just want to say that many people within the Delta Stewardship Council and the science program served in many different capacities within this conference. They moderated sessions, they contributed talks, posters, and art. 8 scheduled talks were by Delta Science Program staff. Several Delta Science Program staff organized sessions. Examples are Dylan Chappell, who organized a session on greenhouse gases. Louise Conrad organized a session on honoring the memory of Dr. Larry Brown. And then Dylan Stern organized a featured special session and panel discussion on raising awareness and shifting the paradigm, fostering diversity, inclusion, and equity in the Bay Delta system. Other notable sessions are that Jess Rudnick hosted a social science networking event, and Don Natoli was very active at that event. So thank you, Councilmember Natoli, for your attendance and participation. We view this as a huge success. There were 54 external participants in this nascent social science community of practice. The majority of these were academic. They represented 15 universities with big representation from the UCs and the CSUs, but also 7 other universities across the country. We also had attendance from many agencies that work in the Delta, including DWR, the Sacramento Regional Water Quality Board, U.S. Geological Survey, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, SFEI, San Francisco Exploratorium Museum, Puget Sound Partnership, and others. So there was generally a lot of excitement around this idea of building a Bay Delta social science community of practice. And some of the next steps are going to be developing a meeting summary, which really outlines future directions and future deliverables from this group. Some of the concrete outcomes are that they plan to establish a steering committee. They plan to establish a listserv with communications and a website that includes a directory of members. And they will convene once during the summer to talk about a community charter and some of the near-term tangible goals. And some of those near-term projects would involve piloting a Delta residence survey, establishing a seminar and brown bag series that might get adapted into a university course, and then starting to build some online resources and repositories of this important social science work that has already been done in this area. So another recent activity that I'd like to report briefly on is that I launched my Delta Lead Scientist office hours last week on the 15th. And Jeff Henderson in the Planning Division was my co-host. The theme of our first office hours built on the theme of the Bay Delta Science Conference, Building Resilience Through Diversity in Science. And we had over 25 participants in this inaugural office hours. It was very easy to fill the 30 minutes, and we felt that we actually needed some more time to get to everyone's questions that they had. So I view this as a useful and frankly a very fun way to engage with the broader Delta science community that will become a monthly feature moving forward. It's going to take place on noon of the 3rd Thursday of every month. And again, if you missed this one but want to tune into future office hours sessions, you can do so by going to the council's Instagram page. These are broadcasts as Instagram live broadcasts in which people are able to type questions into the chat, and myself and my co-host will answer them live. Okay, I know we're getting short on time, but one really important thing that should be on your radar and put it on your calendar if it's not already is the Science Actions Workshop, which will take place on July 13th through 14th in the morning between 9 and 12. So the Science Actions Workshop is a really important milestone in the development of the 2022 to 2026 Science Actions Agenda. It's at this workshop when the community will collaboratively take the top 65 Delta management questions that were identified through a series of workshops last year, together with an assessment of progress on the last Science Action Agenda, which will be released in just for public draft in just a few weeks, and synthesizes those needs and gaps in the last Science Action Agenda into concrete actions to address in the next Science Action Agenda. So this is a really important workshop to make sure that what you really believe should be a science action over the next 5 years is represented in this document. Registration and further details will be announced a little bit later this year. So finally, in terms of the by the numbers report, I think you're probably all aware at this point that Governor Newsom has announced a drought emergency that currently affects 2 counties, Sonoma County and Mendocino County in the state. And I think this reflects the underlying statistics that are in your by the numbers report. North and Central Sierra precipitation levels are only at about 50% of what they typically are for this time of year. The water in Shasta, Oroville, and San Luis reservoirs are at 54 to 62%. So very low. Sacramento and San Joaquin river flows are also currently quite low at 13% and 53% of what's typical for this time of year. And outflows through the State Water Project and Central Valley Project are only at 31%. So this drought declaration is likely to be something that will spur a lot of action within the Delta Stewardship Council and Delta Science Program in the near future. Okay, with that, I think I will end it there and open the floor for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Laurel. Are there any questions for Laurel?
Madam Chair, not so much a question, just a comment. I wanted to add my kudos. I was able to, as Dr. Larson pointed out, attend a portion of the conference. And I just want to say that from the moderators to the presenters to the participants, I certainly found it very, very useful. Some really good information, the flood and other hazards session, and then as Laurel pointed out, the social science networking event in the afternoon. But clearly there was a lot of work that went into it. And for anyone who hasn't had the experience of organizing something like that and then putting it all together and doing it virtually, I can't hardly even imagine all the effort that went into it. But again, I was very impressed and found the information for the workshop that I was able to participate in to be very useful, and took a number of pages of notes. But certainly just wanted to offer my congratulations on what I felt was a very good conference. And as I'm sure it was, everything else was what compared to what I was able to participate in, the same, that it was obviously a great success. So just wanted to offer my kudos. And secondly, I just wanted to, I was very impressed by the introduction of the fellows that are participating in the science program, and all 4 of the folks who presented this morning and talked about themselves. It's amazing to me, certainly their academic achievements and their contributions thus far. And I think we're all going to be better off for them and people like them who are contributing to the work, the research, and to the ongoing efforts to really focus on some of the needs and the future of the Delta. So again, I just wanted to offer my words of congratulations to them on their masters and doctoral degrees and so forth, but also on their work. And I think we're in good hands with people like them and others. So thanks.
Yes, thank you, Don.
I have one. I also wanted to congratulate you for selection of these very talented young members of the Sea Grant. I have a question for you. On the research side, what % of the work is that they bring in because of their interest, and how much of it is the priorities that you set for them for research and development and writing papers?
So we're brought in based on needs, based on programmatic. Yeah, a little tongue-tied this morning. Based on programmatic needs, and are situated in groups that are working on specific problems. But the expectation is that their work on those projects is really informed by and inspired by their research expertise that they've built to that point. So they are selected in large part on the basis of the research that they've done and the expertise that they bring, but they are brought in to work on specific projects.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment.
Sure.
Anyone else?
Virginia.
Not a question, but just a comment to Dr. Larson for an amazing presentation, and I took quite a bit of notes. It just seems so critical, the work that is being done, and to hear these young fellows present their credentials, but more importantly, their passion, if you will, for the subject matter was so incredibly heartwarming and enlightening. So kudos to you for bringing them on board, and to see such tremendous not only passion and talent, but knowledge. It makes me feel better that we're being steered in the right direction. So kudos to you and your team, and truly look forward to participating, hopefully in the next Bay Delta conference. It sounds like it's definitely something we should all be participating in. So thank you for all of your comments.
Thank you for those comments, and we look forward to seeing you at future Bay Delta Science conferences. And I will pass on all of your kudos to other folks within the council and Delta Stewardship or Delta Science Program, because I feel I deserve very little credit here. But yes, I find it really inspiring to go to work every day, because I would say that the passion that you saw today is something that is shared by nearly everyone in the Delta Science Program.
Absolutely.
Well, if there are no other questions from council members, my understanding is there's a public comment. Beck? Or is the public comment not on this item?
Hello, it's Deirdre Desjardins again. I just wanted to ask, because it was raised at the March Delta Independent Science Board meeting by the chair. This is the first conference that the Delta Independent Science Board hadn't either done a panel or given a presentation, and they did a application to do a presentation on the invasive species program and a review, and to do a panel as well. And ESSA Technologies also asked to do a presentation on the monitoring enterprise review. And they got back and offered to do a poster session, which was nice, but it's not the same as actually giving a presentation or having a panel, as they've always already had. And they were really scratching their heads about why they weren't on the program. And
So they actually were on the program. both Essa and Steve Brandt gave presentations that were videos on demand, which is a really neat feature because they are available at any time. And we do expect to migrate those over to a permanent viewing through Vimeo. My understanding is that because of the virtual format of the meeting and because of the need to really avoid Zoom fatigue, there were far fewer talks and far fewer panels that than have been able to be offered in the past. And so the ones that were selected were those that were most in line with the theme of the meeting. And, you know, I think we pretty uniformly through the Delta Science Program view this wealth of posters and videos on demand that are available for viewing at any time as a huge asset. And actually, we got a lot of positive feedback about that.
If I could make one other comment, which is related to supervision of the Delta Sea Grant Fellows that work for the Delta Independent Science Board. I noticed that Darcy Austin was listed as the supervisor for those Sea Grant Fellows, and I don't know if she's still there, but she is also working for the state water contractors, and her LinkedIn profile lists that she has both positions, but she wouldn't be eligible to be, on, because of that conflict of interest. She wouldn't be eligible to be on the Independent Science Board, and so it is a little bit odd to have her supervising that work. I don't know if she actually is.
I don't know about this particular situation, but my guess is that the Sea Grant State Policy Fellows Program situates fellows in a number of agencies. And so the water contractors may have received their own fellow that has no relationship to the fellows that we supervise within the council. I would need to look into that further because I don't know the particular background or context here, but that might be what you're seeing.
Well, thank you, Deirdre, for pointing these things out to us. Is there any other public comment on this item?
No more public comment.
Okay. Well, I just want to chime in with everyone else about our wonderful fellows. The Delta Stewardship Program, the Delta Stewardship Council and the Science Program, and in fact, all even our planning division, we have the privilege of obtaining these fantastic, passionate scientists who really are so inspiring. And it's just really wonderful to work with a group that is so enthusiastic about our natural resources and the science and communicating the science. I think we have some of the most creative scientists out there, and it's clear they really enjoy their work, and they put many hours. Anyway. The passion is contagious.
Then, thank you. May I just say one more thing? I just received a communication from Karen Kafetz, who's the manager for the Science-Based Adaptive Management Unit, clarifying the answer to Deirdre Desjardins' question, which is that Darcy Austin used to work within the Delta Science Program in Karen's position. And she no longer works with us and does not currently supervise fellows. So I think that probably illuminates the answer to that particular question.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen. Well, if there is no other public comment, thank you, Dr. Laurel Larson, for an excellent report.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to agenda item 8, Delta Adapts Adaptation Strategy Kickoff. And I'll hand it off to Jessica Pearson.
Thank you so much, Chair. As council staff continue to review the input that we received on the public review draft of our first ever Delta Regional Vulnerability Assessment that we released earlier this year, we are excited to now kick off the adaptation strategy phase of this 2-part Delta Adapts project. So here with us today is Harriet Ross, our Assistant Planning Director, who will update us on the finalization of the vulnerability assessment and give an overview of the next steps for the adaptation strategy. So welcome, Harriet.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, Chair Tatayan, members of the council, and a special welcome to Councilmember Madueño. Nice to meet you. Okay, so if we can advance the slide 2 forward. Today I'm going to be giving you an update on Delta Adapts and where we are in the process, and as well as reviewing the preliminary approach to the adaptation strategy and going over the next steps for the initiative. Next slide, please. If we can actually skip one more ahead. So as you all are probably aware, Delta Adapts is the council's climate change study. It includes both a vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy. As Jessica mentioned, we are in the middle of revising and finalizing the vulnerability assessment right now, and we hope to bring that back to the council in June. And then we are beginning to scope out the adaptation strategy, and that's the focus of our conversation today. Next slide, please. Wanted to just share that we had a public workshop for the city of West Sacramento earlier in the week. We partnered with the city to co-host a workshop on climate change. If you recall what happened to the slide? If you recall in the Delta Adapts Vulnerability Assessment, we determined that portions of the city are considered to be socially vulnerable to climate hazards, where residents may not be able to respond to these hazards as easily. So we focused our efforts on holding a workshop specifically in the city. We also worked with several community-based organizations and providers to get the word out about the workshop and on design of the workshop. And many of these organizations had representatives that participated earlier in the week. We covered the city's climate action plan update and Delta Adapts, where we shared our key vulnerability findings for the city specifically, and we received input on proposed adaptation strategy ideas. We also asked how we can engage with the hard-to-reach populations in the city. We heard that we should work with nonprofits and trusted community partners, such as faith-based organizations, to spread information about the initiative, prepare materials that are easy to understand and offered in different languages, and use other methods to reach out to the community besides the internet. And I should mention that all of our materials prepared for the workshop are being translated into Spanish, Russian, and Farsi by the city and a community partner. So that's a big step for this project to be able to have those translation services. Next slide, please. So we had several meetings to scope out our adaptation approach. We held 2 public meetings in February and in March. We had close to 70 participants between the 2 workshops, really consisting of local and state agencies, many Delta stakeholders, representatives of the farming community. We had a lot of new faces. We also met with our community partners in Stockton to talk about adaptation. We had a workshop earlier in February. We met with our technical advisory committee and had internal project team meetings to talk about the approach. Next slide. What we heard from the stakeholders was really for adaptation to break the Delta into regions so that it's more manageable to come up with an adaptation strategy, and really to engage stakeholders by the different regions as priorities. Climate vulnerabilities and adaptation may be different for each region. For flood specifically, we heard about really to consider these geographic differences in flood risk, engage upstream and downstream stakeholders, and also look for those multi-benefit solutions to maximize adaptation actions. And for ecosystem, we heard mostly from our agency partners who want guidance on appropriate strategies that address sea level rise and temperature changes and where to apply the appropriate strategies within the Delta. We also heard a lot from the ag representatives. They really want adaptation that recognizes that a sustainable agricultural economy has co-benefits to flood management, ecosystem, and Delta as place. And also, existing regulatory incentive programs are a lot of work to implement and to take advantage of. So to keep adaptation simple and not another regulatory burden. And they also wanted us to consider that adaptation that is economically viable may be different for different farm types. So that's, again, going to the different regions will allow us to dig in deeper and seeing what's appropriate for each individual area. If we can go, advance the slide, one more, please. So based on what we heard at these scoping meetings, we've identified a preliminary approach to developing the adaptation strategy. It's important to note this is the first step in developing an approach, and the approach may be refined as the work progresses. So this is just a basic structure at this point. So we're picturing that the strategy really includes three major components, as you can see on the slide there. The first component is to review council documents to see if existing policies address the climate vulnerabilities findings identified in the vulnerability assessment. The second component, where I think will be our main focus, will be to identify a range of adaptation strategies within the Delta to include. And then we have another component for areas outside of the Delta. And here we're picturing that we would identify a vision and objectives for what we would like to see in adaptation that would have benefits inside the Delta. Next slide, please. So just to expand a little bit on each of the components, for the first one, we're looking at reviewing relevant council documents such as the Delta Plan, Delta Science Plan, Science Action Agenda, to name a few. And if revisions are needed, we would then develop policy options for the council's consideration. And it's important to note that if there are any future updates that are needed to these documents, it would require separate resources to complete and considered outside the scope of this adaptation strategy. Next slide. Now for the in-Delta adaptation strategies here, given its size, physical landscape, and varying vulnerability exposure in the Delta, again, we're proposing to divide the Delta into subregions and also consider the Sassoon Marsh separately. And based on the council's authority, our co-equal goals, and authorities of other agencies, we're planning on focusing on flooding, ecosystems, agriculture, and water supply. And we're looking to form focus groups by these 4 topic areas for each of the regions, and then engaging with these groups to develop adaptation strategies that work for each of these areas. We also plan on identifying the entities responsible for implementation of adaptation, potential timing of implementation, hopefully, and estimated costs. Next slide. And so we're at this point planning on using the SFEI Delta Landscape tool, the tool that Dr. Larson mentioned and that you've heard about in previous council meetings. And we're planning on using this tool to analyze a set of scenarios, which will allow us to identify trade-offs of the different scenarios based on metrics that we define. So some initial thoughts on the scenarios is that maybe we could assume flood improvements based on assets the levee is protecting per state regulations. So 200-year for urban areas, 100-year for small communities, for example. We could potentially look at maximizing ecosystem restoration activities at the appropriate elevations and assuming all existing ag operations will continue. So likely we'll be looking at these things individually and then coming up and creating hybrids of these scenarios that look at different combinations of flood improvements, ecosystem restoration activities, and where agricultural activities could continue. And really so that we can balance the outcomes and see those trade-offs. We may also prioritize flood improvements to protect vulnerable communities, for example, Or maybe we'll prioritize where improvements will protect the most people or the most critical assets. All things that we'll need to work through as we move on with this process. And then based on the metrics we define and the outputs, we can then really understand those trade-offs and then begin to identify adaptation. Next slide, please. So for adaptation for out of the delta, so obviously what happens outside of the delta can have significant impacts within the delta. So given our authority and that there are plenty of experts outside of the delta within the delta watershed, we're proposing to identify a vision and objectives for adaptation actions that occur outside of the delta that advance our co-equal goals and promote consistency with council documents and activities. So for example, with increased flooding predicted, larger amounts of water will need to be stored upstream to reduce flows downstream and flooding in the Stockton area, for example. So one example of an objective could be potentially identifying increasing storage by, say, a certain percentage upstream of the delta. So that's an example of what we could be looking at for out of the delta strategy for adaptation. Next slide, please. So as you can probably tell, we plan on engaging stakeholders, and it's a big outreach process. We plan on building on existing relationships and the approach we use for the vulnerability assessment, and then plan on starting there and establishing focus groups by topic and region, and really working with the stakeholders to identify values and adaptation strategies that work for each of the regions, and really discussing the trade-offs among adaptation strategies and prioritizing these strategies. Ultimately, the council will recommend adaptation that advances our co-equal goals and are consistent with the Delta plan and reflect our priorities in the strategy. And then if we can, yes, there we go. Here's a draft schedule for preparation of adaptation strategy. We're proposing about an 18-month schedule where we would begin stakeholder outreach this summer, identify scenarios this fall, evaluate the scenarios later this year, early next, identifying adaptation strategies for consideration in the springtime, and hopefully having a public draft adaptation strategy by summer of next year. And then next, please, we have for the next steps, immediate next steps is besides scoping the adaptation strategy in detail based on the feedback we hear from you today. We also have a workshop in Stockton with our community partners on adaptation on May 3rd. And we'll also be revising and finalizing the vulnerability assessment, as I mentioned. So that's it for me on the presentation. I'm happy to answer questions.
Maria.
Yes, I have two questions. When we go back to the first slide where we separated it to sections. Yeah, let's see. Next one.
Forward, yeah.
Ah, here.
Keep going forward.
Yep.
You're in Delta.
Yeah, when you separate this by area, by issue, I'm trying to understand your methodology and the comparison of this with how it was done before in terms of the adaptation. Was it separated again in the same way, different way, or not separated at all?
Yeah, we did not break down the Delta and Suisun Marsh necessarily into regions. I guess the exception would be for the ecosystem analysis for the vulnerability assessment. We did break it down into smaller regions just because of the varying ecosystems within our study area. Our study area is obviously really large. But we did largely discuss vulnerabilities for the entire study area, and we did not break it into specific regions necessarily, though From the flood maps, for example, you can clearly see that flooding is a big issue in the Southern Delta. What we're proposing here is actually starting with the water districts, North, Central, and South, as a starting point merely, in considering Sassoon Marsh separately. Sassoon Marsh is just very different. The physical landscape is very different from the rest of the Delta. So at a minimum, we're looking at dividing the study area into 4 regions. And then as we move forward, just kind of looking generally at North, Central, South water agencies, those areas generally coincide with, I don't know if you recall a map that we've shown in the past that illustrates what drives flooding within the Delta. A large portion of flooding on the western side is largely driven by sea level rise, whereas a lot of the flooding in Southern Delta is driven by the riverine flows. So, the drivers that affect flooding happen to generally coincide with those water districts. And so that's kind of what we're looking at as a starting point, and really trying to get to a smaller area so that it's easier to discuss. I mean, the Delta is so large, as you know, and there's differences, physical landscape, geography, all of it. There's a lot of differences. So we thought that would be an easier way to get to adaptation.
And then this is very interesting. Thank you for the explanation. And then the recommendations follow the way you divided or broke it.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see how things unfold. I would imagine that the priorities for each of the regions of the Delta would be different, and there will be a different appropriate adaptation strategies for each of those regions. So that would be what would eventually make its way into the adaptation strategy itself.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question as well. When you say break the Delta into regions, what did you have in mind by regions? And did that take into account the social sciences that are adapted also in terms of the Delta? For example, folks with poverty have difficulties that live near the Delta, have their own problems, and are very different than those that would be generally urban situations, for example. So can you respond to that?
Yeah, we are at this point looking to divide the Delta by regions that are really largely related to the different climate vulnerabilities that they're being exposed to. We are, as we've discussed, really trying to engage those vulnerable communities that we've identified for the Delta, and really doing almost a more in-depth separate process with these areas to try to get to what their values and priorities are for adaptation. So the regions don't necessarily consider social aspects, but we are undergoing a separate, more detailed process with those communities. Does that answer your question?
So what you're doing is you're dealing with the regions and subgroups, as it were, specifically regarding those that have special issues that others don't share. That's what you have in mind?
Yeah, we're basically making a greater effort to reach down to the community level for vulnerable communities. That's basically what we're trying to do. And we, if we had, all the time in the world, we'd love to engage every single Delta community in this conversation. But, it's difficult to do that. So that's why the regional approach by topic area, I think, is a good starting point. And if we need to break down further into those regions, or maybe further into special issues, if that makes sense, and if that's what we need to do, then, we will consider that. But this is just right now, these 4 areas as a starting point.
Any other questions from the council? Oh, Virginia, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, a quick comment and observation. It's kind of a follow-up to what Judge Damrell also asked. When I saw that you had broken it down into the different categories, and obviously agriculture being one of them, are you taking into account not just the farmers, if you will, but also the agricultural workers? And it kind of dovetails with what you were talking about in your earlier comments with regard to the outreach, and you're wanting to really do a deeper dive and have materials translated. So I guess my question is, one, are you taking into account, again, the migrant farm workers that, again, I think they have a large piece in this as well. Just having been raised with, migrant farm working communities and understanding that their needs are going to be obviously affected as well in this. And then two, when you're taking a look at the outreach, and I see that you're working with Little Manila Rising and others in Stockton, one thing that I will tell you is I've learned translation sometimes is not, is not going to be enough. It really has to be a breakdown, if you will, of your entire message. So as I take a look at adaptation, and some of those terms need to be broken down even further explained, if you will, so that we can try to get and extend outreach if we really truly want to do the work of, or not the work, but really doing an effective job of getting more engagement, getting more people to respond and to be active to the call. We just need to break it down a little bit more. So I just saw some of the wording and the phrasing, and I thought we might need to do a little bit better in just breaking that down so that people understand what's at stake and why they need to get involved.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for your comments. So hopefully I'll try to answer all of your questions. We do plan on engaging farm workers. I didn't go into the details because we're still trying to figure out the exact scope. But what, the plan right now is to outreach to farm workers specifically to understand what their needs are for adaptation. So that's what we're considering at this point. Absolutely on creating documents that are easy to understand. It's hard, it's a struggle, but we have really good partnerships right now with many community-based organizations, and they are helping, they're helping us get to that point of presenting our materials in a way that makes people care and want to participate in our process. Good. So fully agree with that. And so we have created other additional supplemental materials that are easier to understand. And I'd be happy to send them to you, and hopefully you would agree that they're more in line for the general public and causes excitement to join our process. So there are other materials besides the vulnerability assessment itself and the adaptation materials available right now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harriet.
Yeah.
Maria?
Yes, I have one last question, trying to clarify. So the way that we start breaking this down was more, the criteria for breaking it down was physical characteristics and geographic, right? As definition of the region, because the judge asked, so I wanted to just clarify a little further for my own. So first you decide that those are the criteria for classification or breaking down, and then we go see the social impact or the communities impacted. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, correct. And I should also mention that, when you look at a smaller area, it's easier for people to relate, right? Including disadvantaged communities and all, really all Delta communities. When you look at a smaller area, it's easier for people to relate. That's closer to their home. And then it's hopefully more of a reason to participate in our process.
Sure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Madam Chair.
Don?
Yes, just in listening to some of the conversation here, it occurred to me that a resource for certainly connecting with folks that may not be commonly thought of, but would be, and I know certainly in the Sacramento portion of the Delta, The libraries are a real important touch point. They're rural libraries, and they are capable, I think, of certainly assisting with some of the language challenges, but also touch some of the families that and people that I think Virginia and others were talking about who work in agriculture, work in related fields, but again are I think critical to the equation of adaptation over time. Obviously, many of them have young family members who may very well aspire certainly to either continue to work in agriculture or go beyond. But I would just suggest that, and I know got the focus in Stockton where you have a large concentration of folks, but would suggest that I know our library director and certainly our librarians in the rural Delta communities in Sacramento County are pretty well connected. I also think about the schools because again, folks who make their home in the Delta and whatever their particular walk in life can be a good connecting point. And there are some organizational structures there that recognize language and even cultural differences and similarities. And so I would suggest, Harry, again, not to add to the burden. Again, and as you said, you take a smaller area you can focus in on, and I would just suggest that might be a good connecting point, either libraries and or schools. And the River Delta Unified School District incorporates a good portion of the Delta in 3 counties, Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento. And it might be that they could assist through their principals and through some of their school side councils where they do engage folks from different walks of life and obviously serve people whatever their cultural or business background is. And I offer those comments, and if there's some contact points that would be helpful, I'd be happy to put you in touch with folks that might be able to assist, at least in those areas that I'm more well acquainted with.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Well, if there are no other council member questions or comments, I ask, is there any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay. Well, I am really excited about this kickoff, and it is wonderful that we are able to use the Delta Landscape Scenario Planning tool. That's a very visual way to consider the trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And I think that will help us in our outreach. It's a way to communicate beyond just the words. And so thank you, Harriet.
Thank you.
So for the next item, the Delta Conveyance update, I must recuse myself, and Judge Frank Damrell will take over the meeting. So thank you all. I hope that you find ways to celebrate Earth Day, and I will see you on May 20. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Susan.
Judge, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Okay. We're moving on now to agenda item 9, Delta Conveyance Update. So Jessica, would you like to kick off this item?
Sure. Thank you, Judge. So today, as part of a regularly scheduled update to the council, we have staff from the Department of Water Resources and the Delta Conveyance Authority here to provide an update on continued efforts for the Delta Conveyance project. In addition to regular updates on the project and the Stakeholder Engagement Committee, we will also receive information on the results of the project's recent environmental justice survey. So with us today to present is Carrie Buckman, Environmental Program Manager for Delta Conveyance at the Department of Water Resources. And I'd like to welcome Graham Bradner, who is the Interim Executive Director of the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority. Welcome to Carrie and to Graham. Sounds like we might be queuing them up here.
Yeah, thank you for the welcome. We really appreciate it. I think Graham is going to go ahead and get us started, and hopefully someone can pull his slides up and we'll go ahead and go.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. Thank you for the welcome and introduction. I just want to give a bit more about myself first to introduce myself to this council and then talk through a bit about what we'll be working on going forward. So next slide, please. So in terms of my background, I've got a bachelor's and master's with both from Clemson University in hydrogeology, 20 years of engineering experience in the industry, the last 16 years with the local office of GEI Consultants, specializing in, I specialize in the evaluation, design and construction of water supply and flood risk infrastructure in Northern California. I'm a California registered geologist and certified engineering geologist and hydrogeologist. And I've led projects ranging from feasibility studies all the way through design and construction. While I do have a fair amount of technical experience working with and leading multidiscipline teams, I also have governance experience and management experience. I was the manager for Sacramento GEI Office Engineering Division, which is a pretty large division here in town, and then also served on GEI's board of directors for the last several years. Beginning in February of 2019, so about 2.5 years ago, I was dedicated full-time to the Delta Conveyance project as the levee and forebay design lead for the engineering design manager, and then also as a deputy to the EDM. So in that role, I led several program-wide evaluations and studies and was also a regular presenter at the Stakeholder Engagement Committee and participant at the SEC meetings. I think it's important to note here that I'll continue to serve as a core member of the engineering team, leading these same efforts going forward, even as I take on additional responsibilities as the interim executive director. So next slide, please. So I do bring continuity in terms of vision and approach for the DCA with my past involvement in the program. Wanted to take a few minutes to highlight the guiding principles for the DCA, my vision of the guiding principles and our approach forward, which I think you're going to find are very consistent with what you've all seen from the DCA over the past few years. Continue to operate in a collaborative manner that brings multiple voices and perspectives. Continue to communicate the work that we're doing in a transparent way and be sure to make very good use of constructive feedback that we receive. Ensure that we're delivering top quality work consistent with a world-class project and organization. Continue to be creative and innovative in our thinking about resolving challenges and opportunities. And again, while collaboration and communication is certainly a part of engaging the community, I wanted to call out community specifically on this slide to ensure that we're all clear about our commitment to developing a project that reflects community input. Next slide, please. So here we see the conceptual schedule for the DCA's main activities. So first, focusing on work completed over the past couple of years. We developed and provided our key concept engineering deliverables for the Central and Eastern Corridor, as well as the Bethany Reservoir alternative, so that DWR could perform the environmental assessment. We launched our geotechnical program, and beginning in late 2019, we started the Stakeholder Engagement Committee to provide a forum for those who live and work in the Delta to provide input on engineering and construction aspects of the project. Next slide. So having delivered the draft conceptual designs to Carrie's team, you can see those items in the third and fourth row of the chart there. Both have now been delivered as draft concept designs to Carrie's team. We're now transitioning to the next part of the planning phase for the DCA. So over the next year or a little bit longer, we'll be focused on maintaining the core engineering staff to be ready and available to answer questions from the environmental team and make any requested modifications to the documents, keeping an eye on incoming geotechnical data, which we're continuing to collect and process to confirm our conceptual design assumptions, continuing to engage with the community, and also providing support to DWR with respect to preparation of permits. For the following, so for FY 22-23, we'll keep all of that going, but also ramp our services back up to support Carrie's team in preparing for public hearings, responding to public comments as Carrie completes her analysis and releases a draft document to the public for comment. Our rough estimate at this point, based on the CEQA NEPA processes, would have the DCA potentially beginning some of the early engineering work on the preferred alternative during FY 23-24, which would of course be contingent on all the necessary permits and approvals being obtained. So that is the summary that I brought here, and I appreciate the opportunity to introduce myself to this group again and provide vision and summary of DCA activities. So the next slide is just a question slide, but that's what I had prepared.
Are there any questions from the council?
I have one. Thank you, Graham, for the presentation. My question was,
I see, Maria, if I see you talking, but I think you might be on mute, perhaps.
I'm not on mute. Can you hear me
Or did
now?
I lose audio?
Because mine doesn't show mute, so.
Graham, can you hear me talking? Because I can hear Maria.
I can't hear anything.
Mhm.
I'm going to log out and log back in because my system settings. Let's see.
Sure.
So if it's okay with the council, maybe I can go ahead and do my presentation and we can do questions for both of us at the end.
Sure. So you want to hear the question? Well, my question is,
Oh, I don't think Graham can hear anything. So I have a short presentation as well. So I was suggesting
go
I run
ahead.
through that while Graham is logging back in.
Okay, very good.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so if we can pull up my slides, I'll run through that. First, thank you to the council for having me back to talk about Delta Conveyance. I'm going to run through a quick update on where we are in the environmental process and then talk a little bit about the community benefits program development and our EJ survey results. So go ahead to the next slide. I know that we've talked about this slide before. I just wanted to give a really quick reminder about where we are in the process, that right now we're working really hard to develop the initial documents for the Environmental Impact Report, or EIR, and there's a parallel process for the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. And so right now that's really the focus, with us working towards release of a draft document in early to mid 2022 and finalization in late 2023. I'm not going to talk a lot about the bottom part of this figure, but I know that this has generated a lot of questions. So I did want to mention that the part for water rights and Delta Plan consistency is still not scheduled out in detail. So this just shows general time blocks. So I wanted to just state again that we are planning to look at Delta Plan consistency after the water rights process is complete. Next slide. So right now, some of the activities that we're working on, as I mentioned, for the CEQA process, we're working a lot on developing the document, which means right now we're looking at technical studies and impact analysis. So we're looking at the alternative information we received from the DCA and doing studies to identify the potential for environmental effects. So this is a lot of work in progress, but not at this point a lot of conclusions that are interesting to talk about. Similarly, on the NEPA side, the Corps of Engineers is the NEPA lead, and they're working to develop an EIS on a parallel path. For soil investigations, we released an initial study and mitigated negative declaration last year for some field work, and we started that in 2020. Then we took a break during the wet season, and that restarted in March. But I also wanted to highlight that we had received a number of questions from Delta residents and stakeholders about where we were going next. And so we started posting a 2-week look ahead map on our public information website, and I included the link here for information. So this shows a general look at where we are going in 2 weeks, and we update it every week. It's not always exact, like we can't pinpoint a date. The sites tend to move a little bit based on scheduling and weather conditions and landowner preferences, but it gives a pretty good idea about where we're going in the next 2 weeks. And then a big focus right now for us is developing a framework for a community benefits program, which I'm going to talk about next. So we've had 3 public workshops scheduled and 1 tribal workshop for April and May. Next slide, please. So that leads into the community benefits discussion. And when I was here in January, I know we talked about this a lot. I wanted to just include a little bit of a reminder about what we're looking at here before I talk about our current status. So the first is, why are we looking to create a community benefits program? We think that this is an effort to acknowledge that the direct project benefits related to the State Water Project supply reliability are not located inside the Delta. and acknowledge that if the project is approved, it could have potential adverse effects that Delta communities would have to endure through construction, and acknowledge the limitations of traditional CEQA environmental mitigation. As part of the CEQA process, we will be identifying environmental impacts and mitigating for those, but it is a pretty prescriptive process, so there are other types of effects that may not be captured, and we want the community benefits program to help address those issues. Next slide, please. So the community benefits program is a defined set of commitments made by project proponents and created in coordination with the local community to create lasting, tangible, and potentially significant economic and social benefit to the residents, businesses, and organizations facing project impacts. And these, again, are on top of the mitigation commitments that we will be making as part of the CEQA process, in addition to what we would do through CEQA. And so it's very important to us to develop this in collaboration with the community, and so we're still in development, but this kind of program could include a fund to fund efforts that are grassroots from the community. So the fund right now, we're looking for a grassroots framework for fund development and management that empowers the local community. And it could also include implementation commitments, which would be commitments as part of the project implementation that could benefit the local community, such as job training or hiring targets. Next slide, please. So just a quick update on the framework development. We started with interviews. So we had a facilitation team conduct 44 interviews in February and early March. And we've summarized the input we received, and that's available on our Delta Conveyance website, where we have a community benefits page that has that information. And we're in the process of conducting 3 public workshops to collect additional feedback. We had the first on April 14th, where we focused on program purpose and objectives. Then we have our second coming up on May 6th, where we'll be talking about ideas for project types related to a fund. And on May 25th, we will be focusing on implementation commitments and the public participation process. In addition, we are having a workshop that is for tribal members only, and that is on May 17th. And we'll be talking about the overall community benefits program development during that workshop. So all of this is working towards trying to put together a framework for what a community benefits program could look like. And we would include that as an appendix to the draft EIR, which we're expecting in mid-2022. So from here, I wanted to talk a little bit about our environmental justice survey. So if we could go to the next slide. So I think I've mentioned a few times when I've talked to you that we're conducting the survey. We conducted it in late 2020. And we're going to be presenting the detailed survey results at the Stakeholder Engagement Committee next week on April 28th. But I'm giving just a quick preview today about these results. We're also documenting them in a survey report that will be released in probably in May. We're still trying to finalize that report. So this is a preview of results. The survey collected an immense amount of data. So given the time that we have today, I couldn't go through it all. But this is a summary of some of the key findings, and there will be quite a bit more discussed next week if people are interested. So the goal of the survey was to gather direct input from disadvantaged communities in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta region that may be disproportionately affected by the proposed Delta Conveyance project. And we wanted to focus on communities that are historically burdened, underrepresented, people of color, and low-income communities of interest, including tribal members. We did not limit participation. We welcomed anyone to participate, but we did focus our outreach on those communities, and we collected some data as part of the survey to help identify participants that did meet those criteria. So if we can go to the next slide. So this page talks a little bit about survey participation. We had 2,117 total participants. And out of that, we worked to identify the disadvantaged community or DAC participants that were in the Delta. And we found 540 Delta region DAC participants. And we defined DAC participants as those that were non-white or where household income is less than $60,000, which is 80% of California's mean household income. Or by zip code, for a zip code that is a DAC, identified as a DAC area, and household income is less than $75,000. So we use those 3 criteria to identify DAC participants. And from that 540 people, we found a subgroup that was also an SDAC participant, or a severely disadvantaged community. So we identified severely disadvantaged communities as household income less than $45,000, which is 60% of California's mean household income. And by zip code, or by zip code and household income is less than $60,000. So just to be clear here, and the figure tries to help show this, 540 is the DAC participants that are in the Delta region, and then a subset of that 540 is the 166 SDAC participants. They're not additive, it is a part of that 540. We did also release the survey in both Chinese and Spanish for those speakers. We had 311 people complete the survey in Chinese and 12 people complete the survey in Spanish. Next slide, please. One of our big objectives with this survey was to try to reach people who may not have been part of previous efforts. So one of the questions was, have you ever participated before in public efforts related to a Delta tunnel proposal? Not just Delta conveyance, but water fix or BDCP in the past. So if you look over on the far right first, this is for all Delta DAC respondents, and 39% have previously participated, but 61% says that they have not previously participated. So those are people that we were able to reach through this survey who have not really been engaged quite a bit in prior Delta tunnel efforts. And on the bottom, right below that graph in the yellow and blue, shows the same question for SDAC respondents. So 66% of SDAC respondents had not participated in prior tunnel efforts. And so the larger graph on the left looks at this question by ethnicity and finds that by ethnicity there are in red quite a few new participants, as opposed to the blue, which are people who have participated before. And then next slide. One of the key questions that we looked at is we wanted to know what resources are important to people. So we asked a question about what's important to you. And the responses included consistent high priority themes of natural environment, clean water, and habitat for fish, migrating birds, and wildlife. So on the figure in red, that shows all Delta region DAC participants. Yellow is the Delta region SDAC participants, and blue is all participants. So while there's a little bit difference in priority, the top three are pretty consistently in the top. So it's clean air and drinking water, natural environment, and well-maintained levees. Moving to the next slide, please. And another question was, we asked, what do you like best about the Delta region? And we had a list of options and asked respondents to choose up to 5. The top 5 priorities were the same for DAC, SDAC, and all respondents. The remaining priorities changed a little bit in terms of order. But right here, we're showing the Delta DAC respondents, and the top 5 that were consistent across DAC, SDAC, and all respondents were a beautiful rural landscape, quality of the natural environment, slower lifestyle and small town feel, access to outdoor activities, and history and culture of the area. And I think that brings us to the end of this summary. This is a pretty quick overview. As I mentioned, we have a lot of data. So if we go to the next slide, this just has our contact information. Again, if you want to stay updated, we have a Delta Conveyance website on DWR's website. And when we do publish our report on the survey, we will post it on our website. And we will also send out an e-blast. Our e-blasts are a really good way to stay up to date on the project. And so I know at this point you guys have questions for Graham, but I'm also happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you for that. This is Daniel. I had a quick one on the community benefits planning. First, just thank you for the progress that you're making there. I support that concept, including a fund. And I appreciate the progress you're making along with the input. I wanted to just amplify something our new council member raised a moment ago about the importance of hearing from migrant farm workers. I think that applies on this community benefits planning. So I hope that's either happening or in the works. Their voices also to be at the table on that. And my question was just if you could give us an example of where community benefits can go beyond the mitigation that comes with CEQA. Like what's an example of something this can do for a community that the CEQA mitigation framework cannot?
Sure, I can give some examples, but I also really want to highlight that we really want to hear that feedback from the community. But I will mention something that we heard at the first workshop. So we heard a lot of concerns at the first workshop about traffic. So what we will be doing as part of the EIR is we'll be looking at traffic-related effects and mitigating for any contribution that the Delta Conveyance Project might have to traffic. But one of the things we heard during the first workshop is that focus doesn't look at some of the roadway conditions that are in other parts of the Delta, and having a broader focus on the traffic and roadway conditions in the Delta may be beneficial for a fund. So in that case, we would not, as part of the Delta Conveyance Project mitigation, be looking at improving roadways that we aren't going to be using. But that could be something that could be included as part of a fund if that's something the communities identify as beneficial. And,
thank you. That's an interesting example.
Okay, and then one other thing back to the outreach. We are trying to do outreach in a number of ways. We sent postcards to all Delta residents. We have our e-blast mechanisms, and we also post flyers, as I think Councilman Natoli mentioned earlier, in libraries and post offices and other places that Delta residents have told us are gathering places. I think we have some bait shops and some other facilities within the Delta. We are really interested in reaching a broad group. If you have any other suggestions, we're happy to have them. We post flyers in both English and Spanish to try to reach as broad of an audience as we can. We also had our first meeting jointly simulcast in Spanish, and we have a Spanish language, we have a translation firm. It's not only Spanish, but they're helping us really do what I think you suggested earlier, Medueno, about trying to make sure that we're reaching as well as we can into that language community.
Are there other questions?
Thanks again.
I have one more. I remember that in previous reiterations of the project, BDCP and WaterFix, there was always an issue during the construction and the truck traffic. And I remember residents one time saying that when they did their own calculations, they said there's 200 trucks every day going by my house bringing construction material. And when you talked about traffic improvement or road improvement, is this something that keeps coming up? And is it something that has a solution of some kind of a off-ramp or some kind of a connection that takes the trucks off the roads? Yeah.
Sure, I can start that question, but I actually think I'll ask Graham to pitch in as well. So one of the things that we've really been focused on through participation of the Stakeholder Engagement Committee is trying to develop design and construction efforts that minimize effects to communities. And one of the big things that we focused on through the SEC is traffic potential. So the DCA identified all of the different truck trips and set up haul routes that would try to minimize those effects to the extent possible. So Graham, maybe you can talk about that effort in a little bit more detail.
Sure. Are you hearing me okay, first of all?
Yes, we have.
Sorry for that technological failure. So with respect to truck trips and overall sort of logistical related movements of materials, it started with a pretty fundamental assessment of how many modes of transportation can we use to support a site. And so we looked not only at vehicle traffic, but also at opportunities to bring materials in by rail and what it would take to make facilities compatible with rail. We also looked very heavily at barge and what facilities could be fed by barge operations. So considering road, rail, and barge, we then came up with a logistical solution or approach for each of the major sites. We had some general, big picture guidelines that we worked with. Number one, we really wanted to minimize the amount of heavy hauling that we're doing on roads that are on top of levees, recognizing that the levees in the Delta have a lot of issues, and in many cases, the last thing they need is a bunch of continuous high volume, high weight hauling on them. So we intentionally avoided that and came up with solutions that would really minimize that type of approach. Then as we started to formulate, then we looked at each of for areas that we would serve by road. We did a traffic analysis, wanting to understand what the current level of service is on those roads, what is the current level of traffic, and what impacts would our vehicles have on that traffic. Where it looked like we were having an effect, and we had some criteria around deciding what was a level of service impact that should be dealt with. We then started considering a couple of other tools in our toolbox. So we created what we call park and rides. So these are park and ride facilities that we can position in logistically logical spots where we can have workforce traffic come in and park and then bus them to the project site rather than having all those workers come in and commute on the roads with their own vehicles. We then also started looking at ways to actually get off of the public roads and have dedicated haul routes that would not use the public roads at all and provide different access points to the project sites. And then additionally, there are scenarios where we're actually improving or expanding capacity in certain parts of the project where we think that is the best, that's the best way to feed the project and to hopefully address the traffic issues.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a host of options that were considered and a combination of solutions to try and deal with that issue.
I appreciate it because I remember that, and I know that, it is many layers on that. And in order to resolve a problem like that, there's not one silver bullet and you need all these different things that you're working on. And I think it is an important factor in succeeding, to build consensus, which I thought that last times around was not as closely and analyzed and addressed. Thank you.
Sure.
Are there other questions from members?
I think there was a question, I believe there was a question after my earlier presentation, but.
Oh, that was answered. It was me asking the question, and I think that Carrie answered it.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you.
Okay.
If there are no other questions from members, are there any public comments on this item?
There are, I have. Oh, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes, there is a public comment or question.
There is. Deirdre de Jardines.
It's Deirdre Desjardins. My last name is French, from California Water Research. I wanted to thank the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority. They've done a lot of work on the project, and they've really looked closely at the traffic issues. And I'm just concerned because there's been a confusion. I know California Water Research worked closely with a geologist who'd worked on pipeline projects throughout the world and in tunnel projects. And I know with a mega project like this, that some of the design work is done early in developing, of necessity in developing the CEQA preferred alternative. And there is a Delta Plan Policy P2 requires that the Department of Water Resources avoid or reduce conflicts with community uses, considering the comments of local agencies and the Delta Protection Commission. And I'm concerned that that process is still really not clear, and the counties sat out the Delta Stakeholder Engagement Committee because of concerns about it, the CEQA process, and it was started very early. But I'm concerned that these conceptual engineering reports have largely been finished, and I'm not sure that there's any kind of formal input that's been requested from the comments. I did work with Delta Legacy Communities Incorporated to send a formal request to DWR to clarify what the input process was. But I find there's similar confusion about the Community Benefits Fund. And in fact, the Delta attorneys, two Delta attorneys I know, are actively discouraging people from participating in the Community Benefits Workshop and saying, no, just do it through CEQA, when I think this is proposed as part of Delta Plan DPP2. And so I just would request that the Delta Stewardship Council consider working with DWR to really clarify what that process is, because the confusion may fundamentally disenfranchise the, like the counties that are the elected representatives of the people, just because there's some confusion about whether this is the CEQA process. And I know when this draft CEQA document does finally come out in 2022, that they're going to be that much further along in doing the drilling and the settlement studies and the particular areas that have been chosen. So I really encourage the Delta Stewardship Council, as the one that will ultimately do the Delta Plan consistency finding, to recognize this as a potential area of controversy and be proactive in trying to resolve it. One other comment I have, the Delta Stewardship Council's last review found that the analysis of the intakes did not use best available science. And when the intakes were first considered, the high end of sea level rise was about 1 meter, and with extreme value of 55 inches. And now the high end is about 2 meters with an extreme value of 10 feet. And I was in meeting with the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority in June of 2019, saying, please do another hydrologic study of what's going to happen with this kind of extreme sea level rise of intakes, because the bottom of the Sacramento River is 30 feet below sea level at Suisun Bay. And during conditions like we have this year, you will get salinity intrusion, particularly towards the latter half of the century when you get high sea level rise, and if we can't raise the levees enough, and a bunch of the levees flood. And the Delta Independent Science Board review was so critical the last time, and they did find that sea level rise wasn't adequately considered. And I just have to say, this is a hard adaptation to sea level rise. You're looking at something that's going to be part of the water supply for 27 million people. And the way it's going, the Delta Independent Science Board is simply not going to have the kind of funds to do the kind of critical review that's needed. But last time, it was absolutely essential. And, it was an inconvenient truth that the modeling had been done very early, and when sea level rise estimates increased, the Department of Water Resources said the purpose of an EIR is to analyze the effect of the project on the environment and not the environment on the project. But you have to do these kinds of analyses, and particularly you need to look at a project and out at least to 2100 extreme sea level rise estimates. And if we don't hit 10 feet by 2100, we really could by 2120 or 2140, which is 100 years from the expected operational date of it. So these are really critical issues that need to be addressed early in the project design. Thank you.
Beck, are there any further comments from the public?
There are. I also have Anna Swenson. I'll unmute her now.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. Pardon me?
This is Anna Swenson. Sorry.
There is no, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm actually a member of the DCA SEC committee, and so I thought I would chime in here. Regarding the traffic issues, I don't think that DCA is going to be able to figure out a solution that will not impact the Delta communities to a point of collapse when it comes to traffic. The solution is to potentially take land by eminent domain and run haul roads through prime agricultural farmland, and to bust up historical multi-generational farms, and that's the reality of it. And I very much appreciate the DCA. I have taken my role on the committee very seriously. I had the intention of doing incredible outreach and to really devote my time and energy to making sure that finally the people, especially the disadvantaged communities in the Delta, especially in the North Delta, had the opportunity to be educated and to understand this project and to understand the impacts. And then COVID happened and it was all cut off. And we, the SEC members, asked to stop. We asked to pause. We asked to put this on hold and to make this opportunity something that could actually be to its greatest potential, and that we really could do this outreach. And we were denied, and we were told that we were going to keep going. So I've continued to participate in the meetings, primarily to learn more about the project, learn more about the impacts, to be able to actually see maps. And so I greatly appreciate the DCA. They've been very generous with us with the content and the information. But I want to be very, very clear. We have missed a golden opportunity to actually engage with the communities, especially the disadvantaged communities in the Delta, by moving forward with this process in the middle of a global pandemic. And there is no way to communicate with people via internet because the Delta doesn't have broadband. And so when myself and my children stayed home, I have 3 internet providers so that they can be doing their schoolwork and I can continue to work from home. And not everybody has that opportunity, especially disadvantaged communities. And so there's a total lack of communication between disadvantaged communities and the project, just by that mere fact alone. And they've done a great job, and they've tried to reach out, and they've tried to reach those communities, but there literally is a physical barrier of the lack of broadband in the Delta. And they have made potential promises with the community benefit that there will be internet when the project is completed or as it's being completed. And my worry is that there won't be any more people here to use that internet, right? So final thoughts. The aqueduct is always an issue. I'm going to continue to talk about this. The aqueduct loses 30% of the water that flows down it by evaporation alone. We should be focusing on fixing the aqueduct and ensuring that the main stem of conveyance for the projects is working at its highest capability, that we are not wasting water by the mere fact that it is not enclosed. That is very, very important. It's sinking due to subsidence. It has the risk of actual earthquake threat, unlike the Delta. The other thing that I want to bring up is that there's a recent report that I read that $4 billion would be needed to fix all of the rural drinking water supplies in California. We plan on spending $15 billion on this project that supplies no new water. It's supplying on the same system, the same way of conveyance, and we're not breaking ourselves out of this eternal trap of infinite amounts of need and restricted amounts of supply. And so I always look to recycled water. I look to different modes and different alternatives that I don't think have been thoroughly considered through this process. And instead, we're pushing a project that is based out of the fundamentals of a 1977 idea. And we need to bust out of that, because I have children. I don't want to burden my children with debt for a project that isn't actually going to create the solution. So I really hope and I'm going to continue to beat the drum of we need to focus on the aqueduct. We need to fix the main stem of this project, and we need to do whatever we can to make sure that domestic water supplies are fixed, maintained, and have resilience. And this project has the potential to actually destroy domestic water supplies in the Delta. And we still feel like that's an unresolved issue. There's no assurances. And I'm going to say one last thing. As far as the Community Benefit Fund, looking at the past of DWR, trying to do these well-intended community benefit programs in different areas have not been very successful. And they say that this is turning over a new leaf, and this is going to be the new, and this is going to be the one that finally goes. And I just have a hard time believing that. I think we need to fix before we build. We need to fix the failing infrastructure in California before we burden ourselves with more infrastructure that clearly we don't have a path or a solution to maintain and to create resilience within the portfolio that we already have. Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
Vic, are there any further comments from the public?
There are not.
Very well. Thank you for your time, Carrie and Graham. We will now move on to agenda item number 10. Vic, are there any general public comments to be made?
There are not.
Members, with no more public comment, our next meeting will be on May 2021 via Zoom. Thank you all for attending this meeting. It is now adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you all. Bye.